I never thought I'd be the one to write something like this. But here I am, sitting in my dimly lit apartment, the weight of everything pressing down on me. My name is Sarah, and I'm 28 years old. For the past few months, I've been dealing with something that has shaken me to my core. It's about my family, about betrayal, and about the moment I realized I couldn't keep sacrificing myself for people who didn't value me. Let me take you back to where it all started. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and family is everything. My parents, let's call them Linda and Tom, were hardworking people. They didn't have much, but they always made sure we had what we needed. I was the oldest of two daughters. My sister, Emily, is 2 years younger than me. And from the very beginning, it was clear that Emily was different. Where I was quiet, responsible, and always trying to keep the peace, Emily was the opposite. She was the wild one, the dreamer, the one who always had some grand plan but never followed through. She was the kind of person who would start a project with all the enthusiasm in the world, only to abandon it a week later. And yet, no matter what she did, my parents always seemed to forgive her. They always had an excuse for her behavior. She's just finding herself, they'd say. Or, she's young. She'll figure it out. I, on the other hand, was the one who had to be perfect. I was the one who had to set the example. I was the one who had to pick up the pieces when Emily's latest scheme fell apart. And I did it because that's what family does, right? That's what I was taught. Family comes first no matter what. But then, about a year ago, everything changed. It started with a phone call. I was at work, sitting at my desk, when my mom called. Her voice was excited, almost giddy. "Sarah, you won't believe it. Emily has this amazing business idea. She's going to start her own company." I remember feeling a knot form in my stomach. Emily's business ideas were nothing new. Over the years, she'd tried everything from selling handmade jewelry to starting a YouTube channel. None of it ever went anywhere. But this time, my parents were convinced it was different. This time, they said, Emily had finally found her calling. "What kind of business?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. "It's a tech startup," my mom said, as if that explained everything. "She's going to revolutionize the industry." I didn't know much about tech startups, but I knew enough to be skeptical. Emily didn't have a background in tech. She didn't have a business degree. She didn't even have a solid plan, as far as I could tell. But my parents were sold. They were convinced that this was Emily's big break. And then came the bombshell. "We're going to help her," my mom said. "We're going to invest in her business." I felt my heart sink. Invest? With what money? There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We've been saving for years," my mom said finally. "We got some money put away, and we think this is the best way to use it." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents had always been careful with their money. They'd worked hard their entire lives, and they'd always been frugal. They'd saved for retirement, for emergencies, for the future. And now, they were going to pour all of that into Emily's latest pipe dream? "Mom, are you sure about this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "I mean, Emily's great, but she's never been great at following through. What if this doesn't work out?" My mom's tone changed then. It became sharper, more defensive. "Sarah, this is your sister's dream. We have to support her. Family sticks together, no matter what." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her that supporting Emily didn't mean throwing away their life savings. But I didn't. I held my tongue because that's what I always did. I didn't want to cause a fight. I didn't want to be the bad guy. But deep down, I knew this was a mistake. Fast forward a few months, and my worst fears came true. Emily's business was a disaster. She'd spent all the money my parents had given her on fancy office space, expensive equipment, and lavish parties. She'd hired a bunch of people she didn't need, and she'd blown through the cash in record time. And when the business inevitably failed, she was left with nothing. But here's the thing, my parents didn't see it that way. They refused to admit that Emily had made any mistakes. Instead, they blamed the market, the economy, anything but Emily. And then they turned to me. "Sarah, we need your help," my mom said one day, her voice trembling. "Emily's in trouble. She's broke, and we don't have any more money to give her. Can you please help her out? I felt a surge of anger then. Not at Emily, but at my parents. How could they not see what was happening? How could they not see that they were enabling her? That they were setting her up for failure? Mom, I can't just give her money, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She needs to take responsibility for her actions. She needs to learn from this. But my mom wasn't having it. Sarah, she's your sister. We're family. We have to help her. I felt the guilt creeping in then. That old familiar feeling, the one that always made me cave. But this time, I held my ground.
No, Mom.
I'm not going to bail her out again. She needs to figure this out on her own. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. And then my mom said something that cut me to the core. I can't believe you're being so selfish, Sarah. After everything we've done for you. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Selfish? I was the one who had always been there for them. I was the one who had always put their needs before my own. And now, I was being called selfish for not wanting to throw my money away on Emily's latest failure? I didn't respond. I just hung up the phone, my hands shaking. The next few weeks were a blur. My parents kept calling, begging me to help Emily. They tried every trick in the book: guilt trips, emotional manipulation, even threats. They brought up everything they'd ever done for me, as if that somehow meant I owed them this. But I didn't cave. For the first time in my life, I stood my ground. I told them that I wasn't going to enable Emily's irresponsible behavior anymore. I told them that if they wanted to keep bailing her out, that was their choice, but I wasn't going to be a part of it. And then, something unexpected happened. Emily showed up at my door. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was just getting home from work when I heard a knock. I opened the door, and there she was. Emily. My little sister. She looked different, smaller somehow. The confidence she always carried herself with was gone. In its place was something I hadn't seen in her before: vulnerability. Sarah, we need to talk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat down on my couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said to each other over the years. Finally, Emily broke the silence. I messed up, she said, her voice trembling. I know I did. I thought this time would be different. I thought I could make it work. I felt a pang of sympathy then. Despite everything, she was still my sister. I wanted to believe that she could change, that she could learn from this. But I also knew that if I kept bailing her out, she never would. Emily, this is on you, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. You can't keep running to other people to fix your mistakes. You're an adult now. You need to figure this out yourself. She looked at me then, her eyes filled with tears.
But I don't know how, Sarah.
I don't know what to do. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't have all the answers, Emily. But I do know that if you keep relying on other people to save you, you're never going to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at the floor. And then, after what felt like an eternity, she stood up and walked out the door. The days that followed were difficult. My parents kept calling, trying to guilt me into helping Emily. They brought up everything they'd ever done for me, every sacrifice they'd ever made. They told me I was being selfish, that I was turning my back on my family. But I didn't cave. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, nothing would ever change. Emily would keep making the same mistakes, and my parents would keep enabling her. And I would be stuck in the middle, sacrificing my own happiness for people who didn't appreciate it. So I held my ground. I stopped answering their calls. I stopped responding to their texts. And slowly, the guilt started to fade. I started to feel free. But then, something happened that made me question everything. It was a Friday evening, and I was sitting on my couch, trying to relax after a long week at work. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I glanced at it. It was my dad. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to answer. Maybe, just maybe, they had finally come to their senses. Sarah, my dad's voice was strained, almost desperate. We need to talk. It's about Emily. I felt my stomach twist. What about her? There was a long pause, and I could hear my dad take a deep breath. She's in trouble, Sarah. Real trouble. She's been talking about giving up. My heart stopped. What do you mean, giving up? She's depressed, Sarah. She's been saying that she can't do this anymore. That she's a failure. And she's been talking about ending things. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Emily? My sister? The one who always seemed so confident, so full of life. How could this be happening? Dad, I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. What do you want me to do? We need you, Sarah, he said, his voice breaking. We need you to come home. Emily needs you. We all need you. I felt the guilt creeping back in, stronger than ever. All the anger, the frustration, the resentment I'd been holding on to, it all seemed so small now. My sister was in trouble, real trouble. And no matter how much she'd hurt me, no matter how much she'd messed up, she was still my sister. I'll be there, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The drive home was a blur. My mind was spinning, trying to process everything. I kept replaying the conversation with my dad over and over in my head. Emily was depressed. She was talking about giving up. How had it come to this? How had things gotten so bad? When I pulled into the driveway, my parents were waiting for me on the porch. They looked older, tired, like the weight of the world was on their shoulders. My mom rushed over to me as soon as I got out of the car, pulling me into a tight hug. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you." I didn't say anything. I just hugged her back, feeling the guilt and the fear and the sadness all swirling inside me. "Where's Emily?" I asked when we finally pulled apart. "She's in her room," my dad said. "She hasn't come out all day." I nodded and headed inside, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I was going to say to her. I didn't know how to fix this.
But I knew I had to try.
Emily's room was at the end of the hall. I knocked softly on the door, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open slowly, peeking inside. The room was dark, the curtains drawn. Emily was sitting on the bed, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the wall. "Emily," I said softly, stepping inside.
She didn't look at me.
She didn't even move. She just sat there, her eyes vacant, like she was a million miles away. I sat down on the edge of the bed, my heart breaking as I looked at her. This wasn't the Emily I knew. This wasn't the confident, carefree sister I'd grown up with. This was someone else entirely. "Emily, talk to me," I said, my voice trembling. "Please." For a long time, she didn't say anything. And then finally, she spoke. Her voice was so quiet, I almost didn't hear her. "I'm a failure, Sarah," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "I've ruined everything. I've ruined my life. I've ruined Mom and Dad's life. I've ruined yours." I felt the tears welling up in my own eyes. "Emily, no. That's not true." "It is true," she said, her voice breaking. "I've messed up everything. I've wasted all their money. I've wasted my life. I'm nothing, Sarah. I'm nothing." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Emily, listen to me. You're not nothing. You're my sister. You're my family. And I love you, no matter what." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the pain in her eyes. The pain I hadn't seen before. The pain I hadn't wanted to see. "I don't know what to do, Sarah," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." I didn't know either. But I knew one thing. I couldn't let her give up. Not like this.
Not now.
"We'll figure it out," I said, my voice firm. "Together. We'll figure it out." The next few days were hard. Emily was fragile, like she might break at any moment. She barely ate, barely slept. She just sat in her room, staring at the wall, lost in her own thoughts. My parents were beside themselves, not knowing what to do. And I felt like I was drowning. But I couldn't give up. Not on Emily. Not on my family. I started by talking to my parents, really talking to them. I told them everything. how I felt about the way they'd always enabled Emily, how I felt like they'd never really seen me, how I felt like I'd always been the one to pick up the pieces. It was hard. There were tears, there were arguments, there were moments when I thought we'd never get through it. But in the end, we did. We started to understand each other. We started to see each other. And then I turned my attention to Emily. Emily was a shell of herself. The vibrant, confident sister I once knew was gone, replaced by someone who seemed lost in a sea of regret and self-loathing. It was heartbreaking to see her like this, but I knew I couldn't let her stay there. I had to pull her out, even if it meant dragging her kicking and screaming. I started small. I'd sit with her in her room, not saying much, just being there. Sometimes I'd bring her a cup of tea or a plate of food, even though she rarely touched it. Other times, I'd just sit quietly, letting the silence between us speak for itself. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One afternoon, I decided to push a little harder. I sat down on the edge of her bed and said, "Emily, we need to talk." She didn't respond at first. She just stared at the wall, her expression blank. But I wasn't going to let her shut me out this time. "Emily," I said again, my voice firmer this time. "Look at me." Slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were hollow, like all the life had been drained out of them. "I know you're hurting," I said, my voice softening. "I know you feel like you've messed everything up. But you can't just sit here and let it consume you. You have to fight back." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't, Sarah. I don't know how." "Yes, you can," I said, reaching out to take her hand. "You're stronger than you think. You've always been stronger than you think." She looked at me, her eyes searching mine for something, hope, maybe, or reassurance. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "We'll start small," I said. "One step at a time. But you have to want to take that step, Emily. You have to want to get better." She didn't say anything for a long time. She just sat there, staring at our hands, her mind clearly racing. And then, finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay." That was the beginning. Over the next few weeks, Emily started to come out of her shell. It wasn't easy. There were days when she'd retreat back into herself, when the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. But slowly, she started to make progress. We started with the basics. I helped her clean up her room, which had become a cluttered mess of half-finished projects and discarded dreams. We went through her things, sorting out what she wanted to keep and what she needed to let go of. It was a small step, but it was a step. Then, we started talking about the future. Not in a big, overwhelming way, but in small, manageable pieces. What did she want to do? What did she enjoy? What made her happy? It was hard for her to answer at first. She'd spent so long chasing grand ideas and big dreams that she'd forgotten what it was like to just be. But slowly, she started to open up. She told me about how she'd always loved art, how she'd always wanted to paint but had never really given herself the chance. She told me about how she'd always been drawn to helping people, how she'd thought about working in social services but had never pursued it because it didn't seem big enough. "Why does it have to be big?" I asked her one day. "Why can't it just be something that makes you happy?" She didn't have an answer for that. But I could see the wheels turning in her head, the realization dawning on her that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to change the world to be happy. Maybe she just had to find something that made her feel alive. As Emily started to find her footing, I found myself facing my own struggles. The guilt I'd been carrying around, the guilt of not being there for her, of not helping her sooner, was still there, lurking in the back of my mind. And then there was the anger at my parents for enabling her, the anger at Emily for letting things get so bad, the anger at myself for not speaking up sooner. I knew I had to deal with it. I couldn't keep carrying it around, not if I wanted to move forward. So one evening, I sat down with my parents and told them everything. I told them how I felt about the way they'd always put Emily first, how I felt like they'd never really seen me, how I felt like I'd always been the one to pick up the pieces. It wasn't easy. There were tears, there were arguments, there were moments when I thought we'd never get through it. But in the end, we did. We started to understand each other. We started to see each other. And then, something unexpected happened. One evening, after weeks of slow progress with Emily and difficult conversations with my parents, I found myself sitting alone in the living room. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's waiting for something to happen. I was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, physically, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying everything that had happened over the past few months. The fights, the tears, the moments of hope. It all felt like too much. And then, I heard a soft knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was late, and the rest of the family was already in bed. I hesitated for a moment, then got up and opened the door. It was Emily. She looked different. Not like the broken, hollow version of herself I'd been seeing for weeks. There was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. Determination, maybe. Or courage. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. I nodded and stepped aside, letting her in. She sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I sat down across from her, waiting for her to speak. For a long time, she didn't say anything. She just sat there, staring at her hands, her mind clearly racing. And then, finally, she looked up at me. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "About everything. About what you said. About what I've done. And I think I'm ready to make a change." I felt a surge of hope then, but I didn't say anything. I just waited, letting her continue. "I've been so focused on trying to be something big, something important," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I thought I had to change the world or start some huge business or do something epic. But I was wrong. I don't need to be big. I just need to be me." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't interrupt. I just listened. "I've always loved art," she continued. "I've always loved painting, creating, making something out of nothing. And I've always loved helping people. I thought those things were too small, too insignificant. But they're not. They're part of who I am. And I think I want to pursue that. I want to do something that makes me happy, even if it's not some grand, world-changing thing." I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Emily, that's amazing. I'm so proud of you." She smiled then, a real, genuine smile. It was the first time I'd seen her smile in what felt like forever. "I couldn't have done it without you, Sarah. You've been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. And I just want to say, thank you." I felt a lump in my throat, but I managed to smile back. "You don't have to thank me, Emily. You're my sister. I'll always be here for you." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Emily threw herself into her new passion with a determination I hadn't seen in her before. She started painting again, creating beautiful, vibrant pieces that seemed to pour out of her soul. She also started volunteering at a local community center, helping kids with art projects and finding joy in the simple act of giving back. It wasn't easy. There were still days when she struggled, when the weight of everything threatened to pull her back down. But she kept going. She kept fighting. And slowly, she started to find herself again. As for me, I started to let go of the guilt and the anger I'd been carrying around. I realized that I couldn't change the past, but I could shape the future. I started to focus on my own life, on the things that made me happy. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, and started to take care of myself in a way I hadn't in years. And then something unexpected happened. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch watching the sunset, my dad came out and sat down beside me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat there, staring out at the horizon. It was unusual for him. My dad wasn't the type to sit in silence. He was always talking, always filling the space with words. But tonight, he was quiet. After a while, he finally spoke. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About Emily. About you. About me." I turned to look at him, surprised. My dad wasn't one for introspection. He was a man of action, not words. But tonight, he seemed different. Softer somehow. "I know I haven't always been the best father," he said, his voice heavy with regret. I know I've made mistakes. I've been too hard on you and too easy on Emily. And I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I felt a lump form in my throat. My dad had never apologized to me before. Not like this. Not with such raw honesty. Dad, I didn't know what to say. The words caught in my throat. I've always been so focused on providing for this family, he continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon. On making sure you had everything you needed. But I think I forgot to really see you. To really listen to you. And for that, I'm sorry. Tears welled up in my eyes, but I didn't try to stop them. I just let them fall. Thank you, Dad, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That means a lot. He reached out and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. I'm proud of you, Sarah. You've been through so much, and you've come out stronger. You've been the rock of this family, even when we didn't deserve it. And I just want you to know that I see you. I see how much you've done, and I'm so proud of you. I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I leaned into him, letting him wrap his arms around me. It was the first time in years that I'd felt truly seen by my dad. Truly understood. The next few weeks were a turning point for all of us. My dad started to make an effort to really connect with me, to listen to me in a way he never had before. We started spending more time together, talking about everything, our hopes, our fears, our dreams. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, moments when old habits crept back in. But we were trying, and that was enough. Emily, too, continued to grow. She started selling her paintings at local art fairs, and the response was incredible. People loved her work, and she started to gain a following. She even started teaching art classes at the community center, finding joy in sharing her passion with others. And then one day, she came to me with an idea. Sarah, I've been thinking, she said, her eyes shining with excitement. What if we started a business together? A real one this time. Something that combines your organizational skills with my creativity. We could do something amazing. I was taken aback. The idea of going into business with Emily was daunting, to say the least. But there was something in her eyes, something genuine, something hopeful, that made me pause. What kind of business? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. An art studio, she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. A place where people can come to create, to learn, to connect. We could offer classes, sell supplies, host events. It could be a community hub, a place where people feel inspired. I felt a flicker of excitement, but I also felt a wave of doubt. Emily, I don't know. I mean, it's a big risk. What if it doesn't work out? She smiled then, a confident, determined smile. Then we'll figure it out. Together. Just like we've been doing. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw the sister I'd always known. The one who was full of life, full of passion. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of hope. Okay, I said, my voice steady. Let's do it. The decision to start the art studio with Emily was both thrilling and terrifying. It felt like a leap of faith, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the right path. Together, we poured our hearts into the project. Emily handled the creative side, designing the space, planning the classes, and curating the art supplies. I took care of the logistics, budgeting, marketing, and managing the day-to-day operations. It was a perfect balance, and for the first time, I felt like we were truly working as a team. The journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. But we pushed through. We leaned on each other, and we leaned on our family. My parents, who had once been so quick to enable Emily's reckless behavior, became our biggest supporters. They helped us renovate the space, spread the word in the community, and even pitched in with the finances when we needed a little extra help. And then, the day finally came. The grand opening of our art studio, which we named Canvas and Company, was a dream come true. The studio was bright and welcoming, filled with Emily's vibrant paintings and the hum of creative energy. We had planned a small event to celebrate, inviting friends, family, and members of the community. But what we didn't expect was the overwhelming turnout. People came in droves, artists, families, kids, and even strangers who had heard about the studio through word of mouth. The space was alive with laughter, conversation, and the sound of brushes against canvas. Emily and I moved through the crowd, greeting guests and answering questions, but every now and then, we catch each other's eye and share a smile. It was a moment of pure joy, a moment when all the pain and struggle of the past felt worth it. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing in the corner of the studio, taking it all in. My parents were chatting with some of the guests, their faces glowing with pride. Emily was surrounded by a group of kids, teaching them how to mix colors on a palette. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. My dad walked over and stood beside me, his hands in his pockets. "You did it, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with pride. "You and Emily. You turned something broken into something beautiful." I smiled, feeling a lump form in my throat. "We did it together, Dad. All of us." He nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "I'm proud of you, kiddo. More than you'll ever know." I reached out and hugged him, feeling the weight of everything we'd been through melt away.
Thank you, Dad.
For everything. Later that night, after the last guest had left and the studio was quiet, Emily and I sat on the floor, surrounded by the remnants of the evening, paint-splattered canvases, half-empty cups of coffee, and the faint smell of acrylics in the air. We were exhausted, but it was the good kind of exhaustion, the kind that comes from doing something you love. "We did it, Sarah," Emily said, leaning back against the wall. "We actually did it." I smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Yeah, we did. And you know what? I think this is just the beginning." She looked at me, her eyes shining with hope. "You really think so?" "I know so," I said, my voice firm. "We got something special here, Emily. And I'm not just talking about the studio. I'm talking about us. About our family. We've been through hell and back, but we came out stronger. And now we get to build something amazing." She smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I like the sound of that."